We're live from the mile-high city of Denver, Colorado, where the weatherman is warning local residents to brace themselves for a huge snowstorm. But tonight, the big storm on everyone's mind is taking place indoors at the McNichols Sports Arena, the site of tonight's landmark martial arts event. 8 of the deadliest fighters in the world will meet in a no-holds-barred combat to determine who is the ultimate fighting champion. Be forewarned, there are no rules, no judges' scores, and no time limits. Testing themselves in bare-knuckle combat this evening, you'll witness Royce Gracie, Brazilian and world light heavyweight jiu-jitsu champion. Patrick Smith, 1993 Sabaki Challenge heavyweight champion in Taekwondo. Art Jimerson, IBF North American cruiser boxing champion. Gerard Jurdo, world heavyweight savate champion. Zane Frazier, the WKF super heavyweight Kempo champion. Ken Shamrock, the #1 ranked shoot fighter in Japan. Tylee Tooley, 3 years pro sumo champion of Japanese professional circuit. And Kevin Rozier, WKA and ISKA super heavyweight kickboxing champion. 8 street tough warriors wage combat in a battle where anything can happen and probably will.
For this third episode of Pioneers of the Martial Arts, it's more interesting because I'm not going to focus on one person like in the previous 2 episodes, but really 3 persons and 1 event. And that is Rorion Gracie, Art Davies, and Rorion's younger brother, Royce Gracie. And that, of course, is the UFC, the Ultimate Fighting Championships. And the importance this has for the martial arts, but also some of the controversy that this has stirred in the early years of the UFC. Now, in the future, there will be other videos on the Gracies and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So I'm not going to go all the way back into the past and how Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was developed, but more in its inception in the United States and how it led to the UFC and what that has done for martial arts to this very day. Rorion Gracie, who was born in January 10, 1952, is really, in some respects, the founder of not Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu's import into the United States. Rorion would move to California, where he would appear as an extra in movies and televisions, and his really biggest thing was really spreading Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in the United States. And that, the martial arts has become kind of a missionary religion. Karate came after World War II was being spread. Judo early was being spread around the world, so much so that judo even found its way into the White House under Teddy Roosevelt over a century ago. He would start teaching in his garage. Other famous people have taught in their garage or backyard as well. Bruce Lee, and while I'm not famous, I've also taught in my garage in the past. He would soon operate a traditional studio, a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu studio, but he would also have what he's called the Gracie's Challenge. And this was not just a marketing ploy. It was really a way that not only could he advertise Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but really its effectiveness. And in these challenges, they're with other martial artists of any style who could come and, for lack of a better word, fight. Now, I want to say fight is a little bit of a strong word here because it's not like they didn't set any rules or parameters. But these rules really were you could tap to give up, or there's a point to where, okay, obviously somebody is going to be extremely hurt, and they would just stop. But the Gracies won, and, well, they will make inroads into the movies, and Rorion's stock would rise, so much so he'd become the fight choreographer on a very, very fun and star-studded movie in 1987 called Lethal Weapon. Lethal Weapon starring Mel Gibson and Danny Glover. While all the films were entertaining, the first one really is, in my opinion, still the best today, and the only one I can rewatch over and over again. And it had Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu involved in the film. It was quite different than the traditional karate fighting or the Western boxing that you see often in TV and television, where the person is drawing their hand all the way back from Mississippi and punching all the way into Canada. And it was a fun fight scene. Rorion Gracie would team up with promoter and business executive Art Davie in the creation of the Ultimate Fighting Championships. And here they wanted to really envision that Gracie challenge that he held in the dojo, quite often shot on old camcorder type footage, and tried to show the effectiveness of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And that's what they did. And I remember when the first UFC came out. Now, it must be noted that the UFC, number one, was not the very first so-called no-holds-barred match. In November 1974, at the World Series of Martial Arts tournament held in Honolulu, Hawaii, an estimated 6,000 spectators turned out for promoter Tommy Lee's tournament. This tournament was an open competition which featured boxers and wrestlers and so-called street fighters. I've always liked that, street fighters, as well as sumo wrestlers, who would show their skills in a 2-day battle with a total financial purse of $10,000. Benny Urquidez, who was at the time rated in the point tournament circuit, entering the kickboxing era just a couple years later, would go on to win the tournament. And if any of you know Benny is short. He's about 5'4", 5'5", at the time about 140 pounds. And he would go on to win and defeat a 6'1", 230-pound Dana Goodson. And he would get $5,000 in prize money. So why did the first UFC and the subsequent UFCs after that take off and catch the attention of so many people, not only in the martial arts world, but people outside of it, then say the World Series of Martial Art Fighting that happened in the mid-'70s? Well, there's more than one reason, but I'm just going to focus on a couple. One was the execution of the new UFC. Rorion Gracie and Art Davie really kind of get the credit for this, that I can find my research and people who I know who have met them and what had happened at that time. They did a great job of selecting the fighters, and in selecting the fighters, they selected fighters that had the right personalities they could develop, and that they could also show class the advantages of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Now, that's been controversial now that we know that they selected the fighters, and I knew that pretty quickly after this first event because of some people I know who are close to that situation. And that was very controversial, and it should still be controversial. I mean, you are hedging your bets, so to speak. However, it wasn't like they were grabbing the greatest Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu fighter of all time. They got Royce, who was not necessarily a competitor that was a professional competitor. So they did it in a way that was really pretty even. And they were also had these commentators. They had Bill Wallace as a commentator. They had Kathy Long. Bill Wallace was a retired professional middleweight kickboxer who also understood the grappling game. Kathy Long was a female kickboxer at the time. They also had Jim Brown, the famous Cleveland Brown running back. You know, he's retired. He was a big celebrity. And they also had another person. Now, this other person was broadcasting. He was very smooth and very good at it. And he also was a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu competitor and was talking about the advantages of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So he was actually, I remember when I watched it the first time, which was a week after the event happened. Martial art friend of mine had it on videotape, had me over, and we watched it. He was kind of like a used car salesman. It was actually quite irritating. But that was to me as a person who was in the martial arts. I think that if you were a person who didn't know much about grappling, you probably appreciated what he was doing there. And I think it really helped explode Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and UFC because he's able to talk a little about what was going on the ground from the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu viewpoint. And I think that type of execution, having that person there who probably irritated a lot of us martial artists, but for the general public, it was perfect he was there. Having a Bill Wallace, who was famous for karate people, Kathy Long, who's kind of famous in the kickboxing world at the time and for women, Jim Brown, the running back, and they had, interesting enough, a young Brian Kilmeade who was interviewing the fighters after they got done, and of course Brian Kilmeade would go on to be a broadcaster for Fox News. So Art Davie and Rorion Gracie knew who to pick and who they wanted out there to commentate and how they wanted to sell Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And
the timing was great. I think Americans in the 90s were looking for something like this. They were looking because that debate had been going on for a long time now. In 1974, the debate had gone on who'd win a boxer, karate guy, or judo guy or jiu-jitsu guy. But the martial arts, it was still relatively young in America at that time. But by the early 90s, it was had been popular for a good 3 decades now. So it was ready to come out and let's settle this question. Now, I'm going to submit the question is really kind of a childish one. It's important to understand what martial arts work in what context and what situation and personality types and body types. It's a multifaceted answer of which martial art is best. But most people don't get into that in depth. They just want the answer. And also one's skill at it and the situation means a lot. But they executed it really well. And they did so on not a really large budget if you go back and look at it. So it was great timing, great execution. And then they developed these really relatively unknown fighters in America. Yes, Patrick Smith was the Sabaki Challenge champion, but the Sabaki Challenge, I mean, you had to wait back then to see it on videotape and buy the videotapes for 40, $50 to watch it. So Judo was from Europe. No one had seen it before, but within this real quick time frame, they developed these fighters and you felt like you knew who they were and you couldn't wait to see who was going at it. If we look at where the UFC is today and how professional the fighters are as far as technical skill, combining striking and grappling, combining all the major systems and styles, and the fighters turned out, there could be no doubt at all that Rorion Gracie, Art Davie, and Royce Gracie, through creation of the UFC and for Royce competing in it, are pioneers in the martial arts.